Hello everyone, it's me, HawkeyeG, and I'm here with another campaign army composition guide. This time around we are doing the Empire, and what a versatile race they are. There's really so many different options that we have to choose from here. They have a lot of different strengths, but I'm going to try to stick to some more reliable compositions and not get too crazy about it. There's definitely going to be units that I skip that are good. There's going to be compositions that I don't do that can still work. But I don't want to go overboard with it because we could be talking about this here all day. So I also want to kind of keep it a little bit more limited so I can actually give some proper demonstrations of how the armies work and what the strengths and weaknesses are. If you are enjoying these videos and you want to keep seeing more, please like and subscribe for the channel, as it really helps the channel out and I really do appreciate it. So the format for this video will be to talk generally about armies in terms of 3 stages of the game: the early game, mid game, and late game. Usually spanning about 50 turns each. I'll be talking more specifically about like what early game is and what range of units we're going to work from, as well as kind of what building options we're going to have. I'll be talking more specifically about that at each section, at each stage of the game in their own sections. So with that being said, let's jump in and take a look. So the first section we're going to talk about is the early game, and since I'm trying to make this guide apply to all of the Empire civilizations, right, all the factions, not just if you're playing as Reichland or Volkmar the Grim, Karl Franz, whichever one. I want to make sure that this is still applicable if you're playing as the Golden Order or the Huntsmarschall's expedition as well. So I am going to kind of talk about things and building compositions in a way. Right, if you start in Waldorf, you have a 7-slot city versus the 9-slot at Altdorf, where you get 2 slots per level up, right? So if we look at something like this, I'm essentially going to break it down for the early game and assume that you have about 3 economic buildings and 3 military buildings, right? You would probably have income, and then you've got room for a growth building and perhaps a military building in the capital at tier 3, and then you have your second city, which is going to probably have another income building, and then you would probably put 1 or 2 military buildings, or you'd kind of maybe growth, income, military, and then 2 more military, whichever way you want to break it down. If you have a pair of tier 3 cities, which is like the bare minimum that you can have, right? I would say you want probably 3 economic buildings and 3 military buildings. And so we're going to talk about compositions in a way that's going to work even for that. If you do start in Reichland and you have Altdorf, you're obviously going to have some additional slots. I would use those to either make it so you don't have to swap out buildings to get the heroes in your army that you want, or you can just stack some additional economic, whether that's like actual money production or resource production, or just like public order, or like I said, hero buildings. That's the kind of stuff you want to put in there. So that's what we're talking about here for the early game. We're going to focus on anything up to tier 3, and assuming that you have 3 building slots that you can put together for military compositions. Alright, so the first thing we're going to look at here, pretty plain and simple. In the early game, you just really don't have any options. Like at the very start of the campaign, first thing you pretty much want to do is spam out archers and make sure you have enough spearmen to cover it. I know we get some additional starting units, but I just kind of want to give you an idea of if I have a full army like this, enemy has a balanced army like this. And if we hop into battle, you might set up a basic army something like this, or you might set up something like this, just a simple little checkerboard formation. Maybe we could, make it a little more narrow if you wanted to, pretty easily. And you can maybe cover the flanks a little more easily, whatever you wanted to do. But just basic formation stuff, right? Basic setup, basic units, okay? Don't need to cover it too much. So if we're speaking generally about what I think you want to get first, if you're looking to kind of have a balanced composition that's going to work against whatever you're fighting, you basically want to keep that rally field that you start with, no matter who you play as, and you take it to level 2. You're going to want shielded spearmen, and you're going to want crossbowmen, and you're going to kind of build it at the same like 2-to-1 ratio that we just saw. And eventually you're going to want to add in mortars. That's like, it's going to take you to until tier 3 to get them, but that's kind of just a great generalist composition for the early game. Allows you to kind of have that defensive play style. It only really requires the 2 buildings, so you could easily get some hero units in here, right? That's how you can get your mage in there. That's how you can get a warrior priest for the casualty replenishment. And in fact, if you make one building, demolish it, and then replace it with the other, you don't need the hero capacity for your first army, right? So you can build the building, recruit the hero, demolish the building, and swap it out for the other one. Ideally, it's going to lead to an army that looks something like this. Now, you might not feel comfortable with something like this. You might want to put a little bit more spearmen in there just to have a little bit more coverage, especially in the early game. When your heroes are going to be a little bit weaker, they're not going to be able to hold the ground as well. But let's get into a fight and see how this kind of army performs. So you can see that we're going up against an army basically of even cost. I tried to give them a pretty balanced army, set up in somewhat of a checkerboard formation with a little bit of a spread out front. Now, for something like this, you might want more spearmen units, right? You might want more lineholders, but in a way, what you really need is damage if you commit to this composition. Even though they have, the cavalry, since they don't have any artillery, what you're really looking for is to thin out their numbers before they get to you, and that's essentially what we try to do here. There's going to definitely be some hits on the back line. They've got enough. We don't have enough front line to hold everything. So what you really want to do is focus down their melee units with your artillery on the way in, especially when their cavalry gets in range. You want to make sure that you have a large number of crossbowmen firing at them. You want to focus fire down, partly their high value units when they get into range with your crossbowmen, and you want to focus down some of the softer you want to be hitting basically just melee targets with your artillery. You want to try to target where they're clumped up because mortars are so inaccurate. You do kind of want to... It's tough because you think you want to target the stronger high-value units, and you definitely want to get some hits on them. I mean, you can see this unit of being Greatswords being at half health is going to help me a lot, but you can also see that hits on some of these other units, like the spearmen, being able to rout some of those units before they hit the front line means that that's where you gain an advantage, right? You want to use the artillery to rout, to focus fire down some of their melee units, especially if it's some of their softer targets, so that you can prevent them from even joining the battle. You want to kind of spread the damage, right? You want to hit some soft targets, some high value targets. You just want to make sure that when they reach you, you kind of have the numbers advantage. Keep focus firing on their high value targets with your archers, and you can see, against some of this armor piercing damage that they have and a handful of crossbowmen, plus the charges with the Empire Knights, our front lines crumble pretty badly, but we've also done enough damage. I mean, you can see right here, right, this whole set of archers is fine, and their archers are starting to waver. So while we barely have a front line left, they're really taking damage across the board, and they don't have enough of a front line to penetrate these forces, right? So you got to be careful. Once everything gets engaged in melee, you want to try to have your artillery focus down some of their ranged units a little bit more, but at a certain point you kind of want to reset your artillery so that they're just free firing at whatever. If you can get some good target firing done, that's great, but at this point in the fight, you want to be focused more on rotating your melee units into the right place and making sure your ranged units are focusing down units. You can see I keep having my archers focus down different targets here to try and keep them from getting back into the fight, right? If their melee units can never return to the fight, we make sure that then we don't have to worry about not having a front line. We do get a little bit of trouble in here, and all of our heroes get severely weakened, so we run into a little bit of danger from that. So you can kind of see that's where the weakness is going to be. They're going to have better armor-piercing frontline units, so you need to deal enough damage before they reach you. Your weakness is the ability to hold lines, and even in the campaign, you're going to have low-level heroes at this point, so they're not going to be that great for holding the line anyway. But you can see, just because we deal so much damage, we end up winning this fight. I do want to note, I also tried not to go overboard on the magic. I mean, we have all the abilities here. I didn't uncheck any of the spells, but basically what we were using was Curse in the Midnight Wind to debuff them, help give us that survivability. Use a little bit of wind, use like one Wind Blast to just do damage to them. There's a lot of like low health and just high clumps of infantry, really great against. And then you've got Harmonic Convergence here, which you can just kind of use to... You basically pick a unit that you know is going to be in a lot of trouble, and you just use this to buy yourself some time. Now, with the same buildings, let's say that you like more of a missile or missile infantry heavy focused army. So we still have, kind of the same amount of mortars. Maybe we drop one more of those and put in another crossbowmen. But now we've got handgunners to replace some of these mortars and a little bit of the spearmen. This allows you to do a lot more damage on the way in, plus the handgunners have the armor piercing. We're up against the same kind of army, and so we're just going to kind of use this as a testing ground army. You could see there, it caused some trouble on the last one. So let's take a look at this army and see how it performs. Alright, so like I said, we're going up against same kind of balanced army here. You could see last time they kind of got into the back lines a little bit, caused some chaos, a little bit of a close match with some powerful heroes. But that's why you want to swap in these handgunners. Really, you know, what I showed last time, it's pretty all-purpose, but in a way that's kind of what makes it weak, right? And so substituting, like, you know, a spearman, a mortar, and an archer to get a set of handgunners in here, these can be a really powerful tool for you as the Empire, especially in the early game. The armor piercing means a big deal, right? Again, their composition is made up of only 3 buildings, right? The barracks, the stables, and the armory building. You can see they did some weird clumping up here too, but we didn't really get crazy good mortar shots off with that. But yeah, basically, you have stuff like Empire Knights, 110 armor. Where are the Greatswords? Another 95 armor, and their armor piercing. Even the Halberdiers, they don't have much armor, but they still do armor piercing damage. So that's why when they hit your lines, they just tear through your stuff. Even the spearmen with shields, despite the fact that they have good defensive stats, they just don't last long against something like Greatswords. Now, you can see this Empire Knight does kind of get a charge off before I can get too much damage, but this is where you have the handgunners start to focus stuff on the flanks, right? And hopefully we'll get to see, I want to see if we can catch a little bit of the damage here. Yeah, and we try to, you also definitely need to, with an army like this, with, you know, the few number of frontline troops you have, you kind of got to rotate them and react, especially to a flank. But yeah, look at this damage. We look away for a second, these things get hit by like 2 crossbowmen and a handgunner, and they're already pretty severely low health. So it's going to go similar to the last one. We're a little bit late on switching the mortars over to melee combat, but that's because we're more focused on this Empire Knight incursion. You can see this spearman does get on top of your handgunners, but this is one of the advantages that infantry units brings, right? Instead of being so, like, if you lean too heavily onto artillery, you can't do something like this, where I can kind of pull these handgunners out, try to get this spearman in. Looks like it got caught up on something. We do have the mortars on the right targets now. But again, so you can see, like, we're able to repel their cavalry pretty easily. The AI is definitely more afraid of your handgunners when you have them. Their cavalry's more afraid of handgunners than anything else. Yeah, so it took a little bit of shuffling around, and we had some trouble getting past some of the units on the right flank here. But so they've got some spearmen in our back line, but you can see we've still got some good units on the front lines here. Their archers are starting to get weakened up. Our handgunners definitely taking some damage in the front and center. But they should be dealing... Oh, that's not... Well, we can't see the damage quite properly there, but that's okay. You can see the battle's starting to turn into our favor, and it really doesn't take much longer. A couple more artillery hits, a couple more handgunner volleys, and despite the fact that we had a few problems with units getting into the back lines, that one actually did a little bit better. So you can see having a little bit more... you know, the crossbowmen just don't quite do enough damage. They're a great multi-purpose unit, but when you're going up against an enemy with a lot of shields, or not shields, but a lot of armor, you're going to want the handgunners. So they are, of course, handgunners can struggle if you don't have the right kind of terrain, but you can see they're a valuable addition to an army like this. Can we see some of their damage here? Yes, we can. So yeah, you can see, right, 6,000 damage. The handgunners are pretty much keeping up, or they're close to keeping up with the mortars, but they're a lot more survivable, right? And they have a little bit more, you can better target prioritize. We even killed the captain here. I didn't even notice that. But handgunners are also a great unit for sniping out heroes. So it's just something to keep in mind. Good anti-armor, good hero, and single target sniping. A little bit less, you know, all-purpose than the crossbowmen, and a little bit harder to wield, but definitely a valuable unit. Now, let's turn the tables and see what happens if we go infantry heavy, right? So to get this kind of composition, again, you really only need 2 buildings, right? You need the barracks, and then you need the smithy. Like, you need that armory building so you can make the Greatswords and Halberdiers, and then the crossbowmen still come out of the same thing. Again, this leaves you a 3rd slot open so that you can swap out some buildings to get all the heroes that you want. And so you can see, right, this looks like not the greatest matchup, or at least we don't have the numbers advantage, and that seemed to be what was giving the enemy the advantage in the previous replay, right? We've given them instead this more balanced defensive army, right? We've got some various melee units for line holding, we've got a bunch of different ranged units, and they have artillery. But if you want to lean more into this like aggressive and direct combat kind of army, it can definitely work. So let's take a look at what one of these armies plays like. So right off the bat, we're using a little bit of a different formation here. I do have my greatswords out in front. I mean, they do have the armor. They're definitely going to take some damage, but this is okay. You kind of want them out front because you're going to want to push them into the front lines. This is maybe an opportunity where I could have swapped out one greatsword for two swordsmen and had them lead the charge, because then their shields can absorb some of the damage, right? I then have the Halberdiers in the back line. Obviously, it doesn't apply going up against this army composition, but the reason that you want... I like to bring a couple Halberdiers because they are still going to be effective in battle against stuff like this, right? They have the armor piercing, but especially if you're bringing an army like this, I don't really recommend going, you know, pure melee. You don't want to just bring only greatswords, halberdiers, swordsmen. It's nice to have a little bit of crossbowmen, like some kind of ranged unit to help focus down or counterattack. Just a general all-purpose unit, right? While you're diving their front lines, you can be sniping out their back lines with the crossbowmen as well, or if they, you know, kind of get a cavalry charge. The halberdiers are going to be nice, but you want something to be able to like actually shoot and weaken the enemy before they land that backline charge. So that's why we've got the halberdiers back here. Of course, we got our heroes out in front. They do have the mortars, so we're taking some damage from that. I don't know if it makes any difference, but I usually alternate between walking and running, try to throw off their accuracy a little bit. They lead the shots, and so you can see right there we just swap to run. So you just move up. You accept that going up against artillery, that you're going to take some losses, and once we get close enough, I basically just charge in. It's a little bit risky because with your heroes in the front line exposed, you're definitely going to be taking some damage, especially when they have handgunners on the front line like this. But really, you can see what I need to do more than anything is keep the pressure off of my greatswords until I can get them into the line of battle. I also... When you're coming up against something like this, you can see I kind of put the crossbowmen in position, and while we're getting our melee lines engaged properly, we just kind of let the archers do a little bit of work on their own. Of course, I brought a spellcaster, and you can see that was just an absolutely astounding burning head. Cut down a bunch of their units, gives us a big advantage in the early game. Beautiful, beautiful damage. But so, like I said, despite the fact that we're outnumbered, you can see... Right now that we're starting to hit their lines, they just don't really have the strength. Their troops aren't going to be strong enough to really deal with what we're bringing, and they didn't deal enough damage on the way in. So we speed things up a little bit here. You can see archers, you just kind of keep creeping this backline forward and let the archers just assist, right? That's all this... Think back to the last couple replays and how hard of a time we had protecting our backline, and here, when you take this more aggressive kind of stance, you don't really have to protect your backline anymore. They're busy doing that. I mean, you can see this one unit of Greatsword has chased off 3 different ranged units. They did a terrible job there. Even this one kind of chases them into the corner. But so you can see, I mean, we get another good burning head in here, but really, you just tear through with these Greatswords against troops like this. Once you actually reach their lines, you tear through them so fast. Now, we keep creeping the crossbowmen up. And in fact, here's where I kind of try to reconnoiter. We pull back and recreate like a new line, because now the crossbowmen can just get free damage on all these routing units. We don't want to lose this greatsword too badly to the archers out there, so we get our archers shooting back at them. And if we're focus firing down groups that are already weaker than us, we're going to win that. Again, here on this side, we kind of reposition so that we can just take out these units as they're coming back in, put this crossbowman in position, and of course get one more burning head off before we run out of mana. And yeah, you can see they keep coming. Like, once you win that initial engagement, it can become pretty chaotic, but all you really have to do past that is just kind of balance things, right? Don't overextend and pull your units back into formation when you need to. But it's okay to have 1 or 2. If there's like a really good chase, like look at this. This greatsword's so weak, and he's still delaying 3 full health units, taking them completely out of the battle, right? And so we just, at this point, we kind of let them come in, bounce off our archers, and run back out. And if anything ever gets close enough, we have plenty of like melee troops in reserve, and that's pretty much it, right? They still have these full health units out here, but the rest of the army is so badly weakened that we just win the fight. So you can see, you definitely take some damage. I did end up losing that greatsword that's out on the left flank, so this isn't a strategy that's without risk, and you definitely are going to take some damage. But you can see this wasn't even a full army that I had, and I'm going up against a full army. So something like this, because of the price and value of greatswords, halberdiers, units like that, imagine a full stack of this going up against a city, right? This would be a really easy siege. You would take damage on the way in again, but once your crossbowmen get into position, they soften up the units on the walls, and then your greatswords and halberdiers, you just send them right up on the walls, and you're going to bowl over them just like we saw here. Alright, so I think at this point we have one last composition to look at, and this is one where we're going to add some cavalry into the mix, right? So it's going to look pretty similar to the army that we just had, but in order to achieve something like this, you do have to make some sacrifices. If you go and look at the building browser yourself, Reichsguard can come from a tier 3 building in any settlement, right? In a major or minor settlement. The only exception actually being Altdorf, where you have to build a unique tier 4 building for them. But so it is a tier 3 unit that you can get. So to get this kind of army, you also need that armory building, right? So that basically means that you don't really have room for heroes, or if you want heroes, you're going to have to sacrifice income or growth building, and you really don't have the ability to do that with the kind of cost that these units are going to have. But let's get into a battle and see how they perform. So again, we're pretty much just going up against the same kind of like balanced enemy army that I had set up before, and we're going to see how it goes this time with some cavalry in the mix. You can see it's pretty basic formation: infantry up front, archers in the back, and we got cavalry on the flanks. And so you kind of move them up, and basically the same thing as before. Now you can see, look at that, one good hit by those mortars and the crossbowmen get absolutely blasted. But with the cavalry coming up on the flanks, the AI is really having a hard time figuring out how to manage that. So they're doing a lot of like moving things around, right? They're trying to rotate their troops to get them into the proper position, but you can see this is harder than it looks, and especially when you have so many units, it can be hard to put things in the right place. Now, these crossbowmen do take enough damage to get countered, but you can see I send these Reichsguard out wide, and from there it's pretty much standard stuff, right? I actually have the archers try to target down some of their ranged units just to get some damage, since especially the handgunners, those are going to be kind of causing some problems. And we just start getting the Reichsguard in position. Now, something that I do over here that I want to note, so you see the AI does a great job of getting their halberdiers over here to try to counter the Reichsguard, right? Well, so what you do then is you counter the halberdiers with your greatswords. So I end up running this cavalry unit back to the front, kind of the same thing I do over here once they start pushing out with their infantry, right? You kind of use your cavalry to bait those halberdiers or those spearmen into your actual greatswords, which will counter them. Meanwhile, we still have enough Reichsguard to get around the back and start hitting their back lines. And then it's pretty much the same story as before, right? I don't even have any of these units on guard mode so that they can really chase, and we're not even really micromanaging the cavalry to the best of our abilities. But just making sure that the archers are staying on target, staying in range of stuff. And again, as we've seen before, against, you know, this kind of composition, the greatswords are just they're gonna cut through everything very quickly. And we're gonna be able to, like, here's a nice rear charge from the cavalry onto the mortars. And once we kind of get everything pinned down, we just start winning so fast, right? All of their morale starts collapsing, starts sweeping across, and from here it's just kind of you know, either cycle charging the cavalry back onto the stuff that they're fighting, or chasing down routing units, especially when you see a clump like this, right? This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different ranged units, right? Handgunners, archers, and that's the kind of thing where in the last game we saw them being chased by greatswords while they were not retreating, but in this scenario, they're being chased by the Reichsguard and they're retreating. Now, of course, I'm not paying enough attention here. There's a few things going on, and apparently Boris Todbringer is just a straight-up better lord than Karl Franz, or maybe I just let the AI set up too many abilities on Boris and didn't give Karl Franz enough. So with being a little bit more careful, like this unit of greatswords would have tanked Boris a lot better. But generally speaking, I mean, you can see, let's take a look at the post-game stats here. with the exception of the death of my lord, this fight actually went even better than the last one. So despite the fact that we didn't have heroes, right, we didn't have like Burning Head to cast, we didn't, like, the Halberdiers aren't really a make or break situation, but yeah, just having those cavalry in there, you could see we kind of had overwhelming forces here and took minimal losses with a single pretty serious exception. But obviously if you're playing that out yourself, you just pay a little bit more attention to it, and you can get some great work done with this kind of composition. One thing I do want to mention real quick, and that is to just talk about the way that I'm using custom battle here to showcase these compositions, right? The point of this is that I'm setting like a hard limit on the funds so we can get a general idea of, you know, when these armies go up against each other, that they should be at relatively even strength, right? So the point is to be able to build a composition for the same cost and strength as the enemy's army, but to show why that selection of units would be superior, or like how it would work effectively in a fight and why you should use it, right? That does not mean that I think in campaign you should limit yourself to this many units, right? You should fill out the roster every time. This is just meant to give you an idea of the ratio of units that you should have, right? You know, should I have like 6 Reiksguard and 2 Greatswords, or should I have 8 Greatswords and 1 Reiksguard, right? To get an idea of the balance of how many of each type of unit you're going to want in the army, even if I can't make a full roster with that kind of cost to keep going up against the same armies, right? So hopefully that makes sense. Alright, so to piece together some closing thoughts on the early game, I kind of wanted to jump back into a campaign. I think it's maybe a little easier to talk about some of this stuff from the view of the building browser, and we can kind of get a refresher on this again, right? So one of the first things I want to say is with that last composition, right, we have Greatswords, Crossbowmen, and Reiksguard put together. Now, a part of me wants to say that maybe you should go, if you want cavalry, why aren't we building the cavalry building, right? After all, you have the smithy, so stuff like Empire Knights or Knights of the Blazing Sun are going to be buildable, right? If you're going for the Greatswords and Reiksguard, like, if you go for the Greatswords, you have to have the smithy. Why not build it? The problem is that Reiksguard are just, they're a little bit better than Empire Knights, and the Blazing Sun, the Knights of the Blazing Sun, are going to have that upkeep penalty, right? The Blazing Sun chapter, they cost a lot more until you actually control their chapter house. So I don't know if it's really worth it, and especially since we're not using other units from that army in that composition, I don't think that it's not really necessary. You either have to sacrifice hero editions, or you have to have like Altdorf if you want to make something like that work, though. As for honorable mentions, stuff that I said that there's units that I'm not going to include, really, that we kind of skip over, right? We really don't have all the cavalry options. We don't have enough build slots to open everything up. I do think that, like I said, there's still room to swap out the Reiksguard for the stables building, and then combine the use of Outriders and Empire Knights, right? Much like we saw in that battle where I used the Reiksguard to get the Halberdiers to chase out and then hit them with the Greatswords, you could use something like Outriders to attack and bait out the Halberdiers simultaneously, right? Outriders are a great unit. They're going to have that armor-piercing missile damage, right? So these are actually a pretty strong unit. Their damage is going to be comparable to Handgunners, but they're a lot more mobile. And so you can use this kind of as a cavalry bait unit to hopefully get, you know, the enemy to peel out some of their infantry, and then you can get your cavalry to flank around the side. So you can definitely do that with Outriders and Empire Knights. Certainly an option that you should consider. I just kind of put together that other army because I think it's a little bit simpler to control, and you could see, I mean, I lost my lord in that battle, so there was already plenty of micromanagement to be had, but just an option I wanted to mention. You can also, of course, go for a more balanced playstyle and get a little bit of everything, right? It's possible to have infantry, cavalry, and artillery here, right? We don't need the Greatswords or the Halberdiers that badly. I mean, you could even see in that first composition, or the second, well, first and second compositions, we didn't have any units that required the smithy building chain, right? So if you aren't going to worry too much about heroes in the early game, or you just end up swapping the buildings out, right, that means you could go into like the barracks and the forges and get the Reiksfort still to get some Reiksguard. The one reason that I think that that's not necessarily the best idea is that cavalry and artillery kind of serve all opposite purposes, right? You either want like like in that very first matchup that I showed, where I had, spearmen, crossbowmen, and mortars, one of the problems there was that if I didn't bring enough mortars and enough damage, I actually did worse in that fight. Bringing more spearmen to cover the flanks wasn't the right decision there. And so, bringing in the cavalry, well, the cavalry's there to, like, chase the enemy down or fight off their stuff, right? But all that's really doing is taking up the place of, like, another crossbowman or another mortar. Anyway, hopefully you understand the point. The cavalry is more like the offensive playstyle. Cavalry is supposed to counter their artillery, but if you have artillery and they have artillery, like, they're just going to sit back. Your cavalry aren't really going to be that effective. You want to have enough numbers of that to be able to make use of it. So while that's an option, I definitely think that it's important to look at what was successful, right? So, if we go back and look at some of these compositions, let's talk about some of the things that we learned, right? First of all, this composition can work, right? It gets you your mage, it gets you your casualty replenishment, and it's kind of a general purpose. But you have to be careful, because what I learned from these demonstrations and practice, what you actually need is the damage. Having too many spearmen to try to cover the flanks just means that you don't do enough damage on the way in. In this composition, you really are relying on the mortars to do enough damage to the enemy infantry as they're on the way in. Your archers aren't really there to win the fight against the infantry. It's more to pick off priority targets and soften things up, basically run things down to the point where you've eliminated enough of their units on the approach to make sure that the spearmen survive. Another thing we learned is that, honestly, it's useful to lean into the handgunners. The weakness that they have is that they can be hard to position, right? Depending on the terrain that you're fighting in, your handgunners might have terrible line of sight issues. But generally speaking, they are going to do the damage you need, right? The mortars are good for softening things up, but they're just so inaccurate that they can't be really relied on, and the accuracy and damage issues that they have, right, versus something like the handgunners, where the handgunners have the accuracy and they have the damage, right? You don't need enemy units to be clumped up. So something like this is really what I'd recommend for a balanced army composition for the early game as the Empire. Now, we still have an option like this for infantry, and while I did lose one unit of greatswords on this, it performed quite well, right? In fact, I'd say this performed better than that first, basic balanced army that I showcased. And one of the things that I think is a big advantage of an army that's like this is in siege battles, right? Because what you can do is just take the walls, right? I talked about it already, but your archers hit everything on the walls to soften them up before your melee troops actually take the walls, and your melee troops will actually take the walls, right? If you get a set like this, if we're going up against an army like this again, we're definitely going to take a little bit more damage on the way in. But once we hit the walls with an army like this in a siege battle, it's over, right? We're going to be able to take those walls easily, get our own crossbowmen up top, potentially, or at least have them start doing damage. And I bring that up because that's one of the big weaknesses of this army, right? We are, of course, lacking in heroes, right? We don't have the casualty replenishment or a mage here yet. But as you could see from the post-game stats, with the exception of the, not paying attention to my lord, this army did perform the best in that field battle, right? This army costs about the same as anything else. All these armies in this custom battle are within 1,000 gold range of each other, right? And this army performed the best in that field battle. However, a heavy set of cavalry like this isn't going to perform as well in a siege battle, and without that casualty replenishment hero, obviously that means that you're not going to recover as well. So it's kind of a trade-off. Obviously, if the performance is good, then it doesn't matter if you don't have the healing, because we didn't need it, right? But it's going to be problematic in a siege battle. And I think that's one last thing that I want to mention about this balanced composition, right, is that this will perform. This is probably your best bet for a siege battle, right? With this many mortars, you can easily knock out 2 towers and probably a wall while still doing some damage to their troops. That frees you up to move all these crossbowmen into range and do damage. And at that point, you don't even need the spearmen, right? The spearmen are just there to protect you in the field battles. So an army like this is going to provide both functions, right? That's the one weakness of some of these specialized armies, is that you can't, the cavalry are going to be harder to use in a siege battle. But overall, I think those are some really solid early game options. Like I said, we even learned that having too many line holding units can actually be detrimental because you just straight up don't do the damage you need to beat their damage dealing units before they hit your front line. I did also mention the Outriders and the Empire Knights. You know, I didn't focus too much on that aspect of the cavalry building just because getting just the Reichsguard building and relying on these can be a little bit more straightforward. But yeah, I definitely think that that's an option, is using, like, combining Outriders and Empire Knights, having the barracks, the stables, and the smithy building all put together is one more possible army composition that you should consider here. It will, of course, have the same shortcomings as the cavalry, but I think that's it. I've talked plenty about this already. We've got some great demonstrations in. That covers everything I wanted to for early game compositions. So now, let's shift into mid-game and talk about some mid-game compositions. So once again, we're going to start this part of the discussion by kind of taking a look at the city and talking about what sorts of expectations we should have for the buildings that are going to be available. In this like smallest province that you could have, like this, at tier 4, you can see now we would have 8 build slots, right? I'd still push for something like 4 economy buildings here. Obviously, this is not meant to be an example. This is not where my army recruitment is on this campaign. But so you would have like a growth income, a growth and an income building, right? And that way it's going to help propel you. Like, that's what's going to get this to tier 5 fastest, which is something that should be important to you. But of course, if this is your starting city, right? So if we have 4 economic buildings, that means now we have 4 slots for military. And now we're also going to be open to tier 4 units. So that's going to include the stables at the top level and the forges at the second level. So those are the kinds of things that we're going to talk about here in the mid game. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to look at is the artillery focused. We have Hellstorm rocket batteries unlocked at tier 4, so let's use them. For me, this is one of my favorite kind of compositions to play, and honestly, this will work so well at basically whatever you're facing at this stage. Hellstorms will do great damage to clumped up infantry. The handgunners should take out single targets and heavily armored targets, cavalry on the flank, a couple of spearmen to hold the line, and then crossbowmen are just multi-purpose. I also have one great cannon in here, and we'll have to get into the replay and see what I use this for. Alright, so hopefully these replays play out correctly. Of course, I made these replays and then didn't manage to get this done because I had to work, and then they released a patch on me, so I expect that it'll play out fine, but yeah, so what I have set up for them is kind of the antithesis to this army, basically what I would build at tier 4. You know, we've got heavy cavalry, Greatswords, Huntsmen, just to give you an idea of what we're working with. But yeah, so I don't know if you need the great cannons, but a lot of the times I like to put 1 or 2 in the army, because this is it's so good at sniping single entities. It's got huge range, so you can honestly use it as an anti-artillery piece. Of course, the problem with them is they're so dependent on line of sight, right? And here we don't even really have it targeting the right things, which I'm sure I will fix in a bit. We're just kind of analyzing the situation, letting it play out and see what happens. Yeah, see, and so now I've retargeted it on the Demigryph Knights, and great cannons really are just they're so good at sniping like single entities, but especially something like this, like large and monstrous units, groups where even if the cannonball is a little off target, we're gonna still see some damage. But you can see, compared to the mortars, and yes, Hellstorms are inaccurate, but compared to the mortars, look at how much damage we're doing to these greatswords. You just peel these things to bits, and yeah, good cannon hit on some Demigryphs can really work wonders on things. So their Huntsmen do get in range, they do start firing, but that's why we've got the shielded spearmen out front. You can see I've got Hero on the flank to kind of absorb some of the impact from that. We don't quite have enough for like a perfectly symmetrical formation. But yeah, I mean, as you can see here, like, look at how ideal this is. We've got a hero unit on the flank to pull in the Demigryphs, and like I said, the AI is kind of a little bit more scared of your handgunners. Like, look at how much damage this has taken. And so you can see, right, handgunners, like I said, really good for like anti-cavalry, anti-armored units on the flanks. I mean, of course, that's their job. Hellstorm accidentally clips our handgunners here, one of the downsides to them. You do have to be kind of careful about managing their targeting once stuff gets close. You might even want to cancel it. Apparently I totally forgot about this and don't have my spearmen helping here at all, and they're just going to cycle charge me anyway. But you can see this is one of those, this is the point of using an artillery focused army. The battle's almost over before it begins, right? We got spearmen in here taking a lot of damage, and that's going to be the one downside that's the main downside you'll see from an army like this. Your spearmen are really just going to take devastating damage, but they are pretty easy to replace, so I don't really think that's that big of a deal. Definitely taking some unnecessary damage on these handgunners. I'm not paying enough attention to the flanks in this battle. I don't even know what I'm focusing on here. It's kind of sad to see that, actually. I can try to blame it on the replay changing from the update, but you can see it doesn't even matter, right? Because now this fight's over. And that's pretty much it. It's the way it goes, right? Like I said, just the ability to output so much severe damage, even on something like Greatswords. These guys didn't even get to participate in the battle. They just got obliterated by the Hellstorms. You can kind of, I think maybe 2 great cannons is enough. Otherwise, no great cannons, all handgunners, right? You just won't be able to kind of get that lead-in damage, and you're going to have to hope to burst stuff down when it gets close. But yeah, this, like I said, this is going to be extremely effective against anything you're fighting at this stage of the campaign, no matter who the opponent is as well. Now, the next thing we're of course going to look at is pretty much what we just watched the enemy use, and that is going to be the cavalry formation. You can see that because of the cost of something like, and I say cavalry, but of course we've got infantry in here as well. You can see that because of the high cost of these Demigryph knights, we actually have a pretty small army here, especially because I'm putting the greatswords in. But you're going to see how it turns out, and we're going up against, again, an equal cost army from Middenland. We're bringing all the artillery with them, we're bringing a variety of infantry. It doesn't, you know, you look at something like this, you might wonder how it's going to turn out, but we saw similar results with the Greatsword Reiksguard combo, so let's take a look at this one. Now, I've mentioned them before, and here you can see I put some Outriders in. Honestly, I'd put them in this more just because of the cost, right? If you saw the way the army value totals worked out, I didn't really have enough money to bring another set of Demigryphs, which I very well might have done otherwise. And again, you know, when you're building a full army in campaign, you're just going to stack it to the brim, right? But the point is to recognize that this is expensive. Now, I put these Outriders out front. This is not what you should do. I don't use this kind of style very much, so you can see, like, I mean, I gave the enemy Huntsmen, right? This is exactly what should have happened with their Huntsmen on the front lines, but it doesn't even matter. So what? So we lost some Outriders, they're at half health, they're going to retreat, but what that did is bought the Demigryph Knights time. You can see, even though this guy's at half health from some pretty dangerous spells, we haven't lost any of the units yet, which is just crazy. I gave them Hellstorm rocket batteries and great cannons, and we're still not really seeing any losses. And just like with the last fight, you know, it looks bad for us on the way in. We're taking a lot of damage, but once we actually reach their front lines, it's pretty much over, right? There's really not even much to say here. It's very similar to the Greatsword Reiksguard fight we saw before, like I said. We've kind of got Outriders here positioned so that they can do some great damage. Again, crossbowmen, same thing, just put them in a place where they can see some damage. I brought in a Jade Wizard to be able to get some healing. Something like, you know, regrowth is going to help keep something like Demigryph Knights alive. And yeah, once we break their formation, we get their units routing, they start scattering, and then all you need is to bounce your cavalry unit between 1 or 2 different units, and that's pretty much it. A 3-minute battle. You can see this ends very quickly, so despite the fact that they brought cavalry into this fight, it didn't really mean anything, right? Greatswords are still important for the anti-infantry aspect in this, because your Demigryph Knights, you really should have the anti-large Demigryph Knights, because that's like standard practice for cavalry in these games, right? When your cavalry beats their cavalry, then your cavalry can hit their infantry, and you don't need the anti-infantry, right? You need to win that cavalry fight. It's nice to bring, ideally, if I was talking about a campaign army, I'd probably still bring some halberdiers for enemy flanks on crossbows, and then you have the crossbows with you to focus fire on harder targets. You might even bring huntsmen in that case to stalk them, and maybe if you bring huntsmen, you don't need halberdiers. But then, of course, magic is good for everything, opening damage on them, buffs and debuffs, but you can see we we didn't really need a whole lot of any of that, and yeah, so obviously this doesn't work as well in siege battles, but in field battles, your cavalry at this stage of the game with the Empire is just dominant. So next we're going to look at infantry, and if you're seeing it, bear with me, okay? This is more theory crafting than anything, but I just kind of wanted to try to find something to supplement this army, because Tier 4 doesn't really add it doesn't add anything for infantry if you're playing as the Empire. If you're trying to go with like an infantry-based, like melee and missile infantry-based army, you don't get anything new at Tier 4. So I tried to find something. The reason that I'm bringing War Wagons into this battle is because they have similar speed, right? If we look at some of these infantry units, they're going to have, they have pretty low speed. The War Wagons have, like, moderate speed, right? So this is something you can kind of keep in your formation. The standard War Wagons are going to have this is like bringing a handgunner that's slightly higher up than normal, so they should be able to keep line of sight, have decent mobility. The War Wagons mortars, the theory is that these are going to force the enemy to come to you, but you can still then move these and keep them relatively with the army. But we're going to go up against this same kind of composition from the enemy. We're going to take the aggressive posture, and we'll see how it plays out. So obviously this works pretty much the same as the previous infantry formations and composition, just because we don't really have anything new to add, right? Like I said, I kind of put these in here, and of course it's also kind of to prove a point that this infantry composition is just not going to do it at this point in the game. I mean, we are going to win this fight, but it's not going to be pretty. The War Wagons with mortars, like I said, their purpose is to try and draw out the enemy, but the problem is they have to stop moving in order to fire. And the other problem is that if your enemy has artillery, they're probably not going to be drawn out even if you do bring these War Wagons. Like I said, I just tried to bring something that can accompany the infantry on their march in. Same thing with these chariot, like the missile chariot War Wagons, the standard variant. Just hoping that they can get the handgunner type of fire, right? The armor-piercing bullets, without having to be, they're hopefully less vulnerable. Obviously, they took some great cannon shots that really did not help them. But the idea is they're, able to stay with the formation, but they can be in the back lines and still get good shots through. And but you can see the important players here really are more your missile units and your infantry units, right? We really are on an infantry-focused stack here. Once things start getting clumped up, we can at least see a little bit of action from those War Wagons with mortars. And we keep them decently in the back line, but we can at least move them into safer zones as needed. And but you can see this is pretty brutal, right? We're not losing units, but we're losing fights here and there. We do kind of manage. It's similar to that other fight where a lot of their missile units kind of get pushed back, and so just by disrupting their formations, we can gain sort of a positional advantage. But we, even if with bringing these War Wagons, we don't really have the missile units to, or we don't have the melee units really to get on top of all their artillery. And so it turns into a pretty chaotic battle, gets a little bit desperate here. We got a lot of units that are routing and rallying. So it's just a bit desperate on both sides. We would have won this fight already if we had come in here with the cavalry, even with the smaller number of total units that we had for the same cost, right? And yeah, you can see just trying to scramble and cover everything, keep everything rallied. Again, I don't know if I can... Ooh, valiant defeat. Okay, well, I'm pretty sure when I did this replay that I won this fight. Maybe I lost it, but I'm gonna blame this one on the patch changing the statistics on things. But you can see what we're going for here, and really you can see. I'm trying to give. Well, we have another replay to look at without the War Wagons. Let's look at that one first. Right. So here we're coming without the War Wagons. In a way, this does give us the advantage, right? One of the things to consider when you're building armies in this game, and I'm sure I talk about this plenty, but and it's been talked about by plenty of other people. You want to try to specialize in things, right? The weakness of this army is, of course, their vulnerability to all of these you know, Hellstorm rocket batteries. But the advantage is, like, sure, these great cannons, a nice great cannon shot is going to look really bad on your infantry, right? It's going to do serious damage. But it's not going to be as bad as when those great cannons were taking out war wagons before they reached the front lines. And you can see here, this is what I'm talking about. Like, that was pretty good. Did those units die? Looks like they're dead. But that, like, 4 units out of that Greatswords versus, like, 1 war wagon out of 3 going down. So you can see it's kind of overkill. The Handgunners obviously are going to be great. They're fairly versatile. But the Huntsmen aren't going to be as good because they're going to do anti-large damage. So having, like, a massive infantry is still going to be pretty good. Now, it really helps that we get a burning head off there. That was devastating. And, well, because they use spells on me, you know, fair is fair. But that's another thing, is being able to select heroes, and especially magic, that will have good synergy with your army, right? Something like this, I'm not necessarily looking for, like, healing magic. I'm looking for either, like, debuffs on the enemy army, or maybe buffs on mine, or otherwise just outright damage, right? If they got the artillery damage to soften me up, so I need some other kind of damage to level the playing field. But again, this is pretty much what you'd expect, right? We get here, and once we start hitting the front lines, it just throws everything into total disarray. Not the best unit control by me on all fronts, but you can see we try to surround some of their units and gain advantageous fights, try to use the Halberdiers to chase stuff down until we can, you know, chase it away and get into the back lines here. Yeah, I tried really hard to get this Halberdier to chase this Huntsman, and they just kept running into the enemy Halberdiers. Kind of reposition my Greatswords here and draw a line with my Huntsmen. Not even sure. The Huntsmen don't really have value in this particular battle, but the reason that you bring these is because of the anti-large, right? You want some Halberdiers in the back line. You put the Halberdiers in the front line if there's no cavalry or anything to deal with. But, like, it'd be bad if they got a big flank off, or they had, you know, the right kinds of units to counter your infantry. So that's why you want to bring something that can counter that counter, right? If that makes sense. But you can see we're starting to win this here. Obviously, the war wagons was a bit of a failed experiment. But again, we would have won this fight. We would have already won this fight with that cavalry composition. Again, it's true that cavalry works better in a field battle than it does in a siege battle. And I really should have paid more attention to the timestamp on when we won the game with that, with the artillery formation. But with the artillery formation, it really is more about, it's gonna be a longer, more drawn-out battle. You're not trying to end it as quickly, but you're gonna see defeat. I think there's something very broken about this, because you could see that we were winning this. Like, we very much had the lead there. Let me go back and... yeah. I mean, I guess this is what happens when you make these videos in your spare time, and then you have to work for 2 days in a row when they release a patch. You can see that we're winning the fight here, like, by a pretty significant margin. And what the next step here is kind of what we saw in the last video with infantry, right? Here's where I kind of want to rebuild my lines, right? Get my infantry back into positions where they can protect my missile units, and have the missile units start focusing down what's left, because a lot of their strongest units are the missile units we've chased away, right? I can use handful of, like, greatsword units to counter what they have on the front lines here. I'm really curious how, like, look at the balance of power. Somehow we lose this fight. That one I can definitely blame on the patch breaking the replay. Hopefully you can still get some value out of that. I mean, we're clearly on the path to winning. And like I said, the next step is just to basically pull your infantry back and try to keep them in reserve. Use them to counterattack any other enemy infantry or heroes that come forward, and have your, like, all of those huntsmen with a lot of health and ammunition left should be able to 2 or 3 3 of them at once, targeting down all the individual units coming back into the fight. Should be an easy win. Alright, so that covers the new units and the different kinds of compositions that I think you have available to you at Tier 4. Obviously, I expect that it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it because maybe it's important to say it. You should have flexibility with these kinds of formations and compositions, right? What I'm showing you is just to give you a taste of what kind of compositions you should use, what formations you should use with those compositions, and how to, like, approach fights conceptually, right? Again, the artillery that you get as the Empire at tier 4 is really just one of your strongest tools, if not your absolute strongest tool, and you can see in the battle results, even on broken replays, how dominant it is. You don't really gain anything for your infantry, but ideally with your economy and the heroes you can get at this late stage of the campaign, you can still make use of them, and you can see, like, this is going to be a somewhat cheaper army than your army full of cavalry. If we look at the artillery army, well, so you can see we kind of had to cheap out on some of the infantry units in order to afford the artillery, but the artillery and the missile units really have their value here. So, but even so, you can also see the cavalry army has their place here, right? The Demigryphs are very strong units. They're very good. They're very powerful. If you like cavalry, you have such a wide variety of options at this stage of the game between like Outriders. We'll talk about some of these, but you just have a variety of cavalry at different levels of strength, different costs that perform different purposes. You need something more than just the cavalry to be able to like supplement the cavalry and win those fights. And those armies will be expensive, but again, ideally in campaign, you'll reach a point where you can afford, multiple armies. Maybe you have a cavalry army running around and clearing people off the field, and then you have an artillery-focused army to come in and sweep out cities with the sieges. Hellstorm rocket batteries are so good in sieges. And obviously great cannons are still pretty good in sieges as well, really good at destroying the enemy fortifications. So for honorable mentions, if you're gonna go missile focused, I guess I don't think it makes sense to go like missile infantry focused at this point. The power of the artillery is so good. Like, could you put more crossbowmen and more huntsmen in here and take something out that you think would really add value? The only advantage an army like that is going to have that it's cheaper. If you really like missile units, you can try to find a way to make it work with the artillery composition. But yeah, I think that at this stage of the campaign, you're a fool not to use the artillery in place of like a missile heavy army. Another honorable mention is a balanced army. If we cut down on some of this stuff and we throw in maybe some Reichsguard and some Demigryphs with halberds, you can make an army like this, right? You can, of course, have artillery and missile units like melee infantry and missile infantry and cavalry. But there's problems with this, right? Like this seems great on paper, but part of the problem is this is only really feasible if you're starting in Reichland, right? And so you can do it. Don't get me wrong, there's definitely campaigns that I play where you get a bunch of artillery and then you have a couple cavalry on the side to flank them. But yeah, you probably won't have the building slots necessary to be able to grab all these units without having to sacrifice too heavily on your economy. You're also going to have to put a lot of work into micromanaging it, right? If you want to make effective use of the cavalry, you're going to end up ignoring, like, your artillery's going to get hit, or your like missile units are going to get overwhelmed if you're not paying attention. But if you don't pay enough attention to your cavalry, they die. You just have to divide your attention between like offensive action and defensive reaction too heavily with a balanced army like this. You have to do so much work to position and target your units and micromanage that it's hard to be effective. And as we can see from the replays, I think you are better off leaning more heavily on another style, either leaning more heavily into a defensive reactive play style or leaning more heavily into an offensive proactive play style, and just accepting that those styles have risks. I mean, we watched those crossbowmen take a really heavy mortar hit in the last set of replays, and but it just doesn't matter, right? You just have to accept that as part of it, and then you can move past that and succeed. The last honorable mention here is the Outrider grenade launchers. Like, this is truly a splendid unit. They're powerful, they're fun to use. Even having like one or two of these in an army, you can distract the enemy so heavily. It gives you plenty of opportunities for micromanagement in the early parts of a battle, especially if you're using like a defensive style. You just have the Outriders harassing the whole time. Their damage can be amazing, but I couldn't really find the right place for them in the compositions I presented here. Part of the issue is you need the stables, the smithy, and the forges, right? This comes from the cavalry building, but you need the artillery building to get it. And at this stage of the campaign, you should probably be picking one or the other. You shouldn't be trying to do both cavalry and artillery. It's just an extra build slot that you're kind of wasting. So those are my thoughts on the mid-game armies and compositions that you have available to you. Like I said, because you open up those like cavalry and artillery options, that's what you want to lean more heavily into. But it doesn't change things too much. You basically just have one style that you're going to pick, and you can probably stick with it. The infantry style can still work, but I think at this phase of the game, you should phase it out of your options and switch into something else. So with that, let's move on and take a look at some of the late game armies. Alright, so for late game compositions, we're just going to jump back into here. I mean, I feel like there's not too much to talk about. Just review. Right, at tier 5, we're going to have Luminark of Hysh, the Steam Tank, and the Hellblaster Volley Gun. And we're pretty much going to ignore any requirements for any army compositions. At this stage of the game, I'm going to assume that you control a decent amount of territory, you have enough variety of buildings to produce literally any unit in the roster, and that you have enough money to be able to afford it all. So with that, let's take a look at a couple of compositions. Alright, so for the enemy here, I kind of went in with like a balanced army. Right, I didn't incorporate a lot of the high tier units. I didn't really want to go too overboard here with what they're going to bring to the table. And to be honest, this is probably something that you might see. I feel like they might not even bring the Demigryphs, but I mean, we've seen how the AI builds armies. I tried to still make it something somewhat serious though. Like there's a lot of threats in this army to us, so it's going to be challenging. First army we're going to look at here is the artillery focused army, right? We now have Hellblaster volley guns, steam tanks, and Luminarks, so let's use them and try to have some fun. You can see that we're leaning very heavy on the artillery in this one, right? We've sometimes this is more than what I'd recommend, really, but the Hellblaster volley guns effectively replace your handgunners. The upside is they do more damage and have more range. Then the obvious downside is that as artillery, they have much less mobility and survivability. We still have the Hellstorm rocket batteries. You're not going to find anything better in the Empire roster for anti-infantry, especially in artillery. We've got the Luminark. Now, these you could maybe say are redundant compared to the Hellblaster, but this is even more, like the Hellblaster is really good and it's kind of all-purpose, right? It has the armor piercing. It's not specifically anti-large or anti-infantry. The Luminark, I guess, isn't specifically anti-large either, but the amount of it's very high damage single target fire, right? If you've ever had experience with these, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We're bringing this as like a Lord, Hero, and single entity sniping unit, right? And then the steam tanks, I feel like these are questionable. They're so expensive, and that's the biggest reason that there's a question mark on these for me. But essentially, this is a single great cannon that also is unbreakable and very strong. This is not an artillery unit. This is a holding unit. But since we're going to be building into that artillery building and having this is something you should still put in your army, right? You can see I have like 2 Huntsmen and 2 Halberdiers. We barely have enough to like protect the backline if things go wrong. But that's why you bring stuff like this, right? You just make an even more powerful front line that they're going to want to destroy. So we've got a light wizard then too to be able to like pin armies in place. The buffs on it aren't really going to help, but the Net of Ammontok is going to help, and maybe some of the offensive spells to clean up some of the stuff that the Hellstorms miss. But anyway, let's get into the replay and watch it and hope that this replay doesn't somehow cause a winning battle to be a defeat. So, I don't know if I'd say my formation is perfect on this one, and funnily enough, you can see we actually start the battle where we're in range of their artillery, but because of my formation, my artillery isn't in range of theirs, but I'm not really even going to move up, right? We've got the Hellblasters on the front line, so their view isn't obstructed. We've got the Hellstorms in the back, and then we've got these Luminarks here, so they can still kind of fire over, but without having to spread out the formation too greatly. Now, I sent this Light Mage forward to try and get some spells off, and it just started taking a bit of damage, so we kind of bounced it back. It's just tough to get it in there because we've got the steam tanks shooting at it, right? Oh, see, yeah, you can see that is pretty painful. That's very painful. But we just barely get one of these off. And, of course, you know, That's what we bring it here for. Now, this was kind of a waste of the Light Mage. I think there's different ways that I could have done this, but basically I wanted to provoke them into leaving their front lines. And as you can see, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to have to pull the Light Mage back and kind of keep them out of the fight. They're definitely wasting their artillery on our heroes, which is another great thing. And so you can see this is kind of why you've got these heroes in the front line. We've got the steam tanks up here. They finally wise up and put their Hellstorms in position to start shooting on our back line. But really, these units are just there to protect against stuff like this if it gets there. So now we're going to see how good are our Hellstorms going to do against these, right? Can our volley guns take them out effectively? There you see a shot. 2 shots hit on these Demigryph Knights from the Luminark, and even that's kind of overkill because these aren't single entities, right? They're large units, but you can still see the power of the Luminark, right? It's an expensive unit. It can be hard to use and unwieldy, but when it lands, it really does land. At this point, since we've got heroes on flying mounts as well, I start sending them to the back line to hit their artillery. I mean, we've got no real reason not to. You can see these Demigryphs took enough damage from the Huntsmen and the Hellblaster on the way in. We did kind of let some of this hero get in here, and really these Luminarks should have been focusing down the heroes from the start, but being at this point blank range, you can see these Hellblaster guns are just firing away on this, and especially once he breaks the lines. Once he breaks away from that formation, he's going to be in a lot of trouble. We did get enough like spells cast against this Empire Captain to weaken him. The Handgunners and the Witch Hunter back there doing a great job, but really this is acceptable damage on a line holding unit. And you can see we're just dealing devastating damage to their army, especially some of their high value targets, right? The Demigryph Knights have been routed. One of their heroes is all but dead. Some of our heroes are in a pretty perilous state, but that's kind of what you're using them for. And you could see right there, fast forwarded at the wrong moment, blink and you miss it, the enemy lord is dead. And that's just the power of this kind of composition, right? Especially if you're focus firing. But yeah, Hellblaster volley guns, armor piercing missiles in this game are extremely effective. You can see the effectiveness of them there. The Luminarks do really high damage. All of this infantry is just getting bursted down. Like, the Greatswords never get to see the light of day. Here goes the entire army, and now all we have to do is use stuff like the Hellblaster volley guns, the Luminark of Hysh, and maybe some heroes that have some health to go out here and snipe down this steam tank. We're not really going to watch that. I don't think there's much of a point to it, but you get the idea, right? Well, actually, there we go. Before I could finish explaining it, it happened. Yeah, that's pretty much how it goes. So you can see, despite the fact that we have, very little infantry for actually holding the line, that it's very hero focused, and we definitely took some damage on the heroes. We could maybe position 1 or 2 rocket batteries out in the front instead to prevent this. If you know you're going up against enemy artillery that's going to have range, this is maybe where you want to kind of position some of your artillery far enough forward to provoke a response from them. Took a bit of a gamble with that Light Mage, but you can see we barely even look at how the finishing position of this formation. We barely had our formation disrupted whatsoever. As long as you're focus firing down some of the units like cavalry as they're coming in to make sure that they don't get to you, the cavalry and the heroes are very important targets for you to hit. But yeah, even you can really lean heavily into artillery in the late game. It's going to be expensive for you, but this is obviously a very effective composition. Alright, so we're at tier 5, and we don't gain anything for cavalry, but Demigryphs are still quite strong, so I wanted to see about pairing them up with something. Now, this is the army that you're going to see in the replay that we're going to watch, and you can see one of the downsides to this is how incredibly prohibitively expensive this is. Demigryphs are already expensive on their own, and it's hard to just lean into cavalry with nothing else going for it, especially in a siege battle, right? This kind of army would be almost useless in a siege battle, or at least really hard to get value out of without some kind of artillery. But I wanted to choose some kinds of artillery that would be able to somewhat keep up with the cavalry, right? I mean, if we're looking at something like Hellblasters, Great Cannons, Hellstorms, 20 speed, that's nowhere near what we need. Even the steam tanks and chariots are going to be very slow compared to a lot of these units, but that was the point, right? Was to bring these in. This is definitely, I don't think that this is a great army for fighting sieges, but this is going to be an incredible battle for fighting or an incredible army for fighting land battles, right? I don't know if the artillery is the right choice, but to go entirely into cavalry, I guess just isn't my style, and I don't know what else I'd really recommend pairing it with, right? The fact is this is going to be an expensive army, but like I said, this is the kind of thing you can run around and like fight enemy armies with out in the field and do extremely well, and then maybe bring some cheaper armies where you just stack, you know, a bunch of infantry and some artillery in order to like clean up cities and take out sieges. You know, I think that having a variety in here is good. In fact, I kind of think that I could even drop some of these steam tanks and put in something like some outriders instead, right? That's going to be a little bit more reasonable on the price. These are still going to do, like, having some ranged units is going to be nice to be able to, like these are what you use to fight their halberdiers. Of course, you have outriders for fighting their halberdiers too. You've got the Luminark for still, like, hero targeting. If you can get some advanced hits on their hero units or any single entities, even though we're bringing a lot of anti-large with the Demigryph Knights, it's still really nice to kind of just give yourself that early advantage. And then bringing something like Reiksguard or maybe even Empire Knights just for the cleanup, right? You bring some cavalry and you can send these wide out on the flanks for either cleaning up retreating units or flanking their artillery, whereas at this point you're really just sending the cavalry into the front line. I think I've rambled enough though. Let's go in and see how it plays in the replay. So in this replay, I kind of do the same thing with the Outriders. We've got Vanguard deployment for them, so I try putting them right on the front lines. Of course, this works about as well as it did the last time. I didn't learn my lesson, and these get pretty much obliterated. With stuff like this, you might want to use it as bait, but you absolutely have to keep it out of range of their missile units, right? You want to use this to come in and damage their infantry once you've baited their infantry out, their melee infantry out, with your cavalry, right? So, again, made stupid mistakes here with the Outriders grenade launchers. We don't really get to showcase them. One Luminark right into the back of my own units into the ground, but you can see that other one hits the wizard, and that puts us at a big advantage there. It's really nice. Yeah, and I basically just run the steam tanks in there to try to get things to clump up. If anything, the steam tanks in this scenario are more holding units, right? These are, well, this one I kind of sit back. You know, we've got a targeting Boris Todbringer, hoping to get some damage on there because somehow he's just a beast, and devastating Karl Franz. I suppose with enough stacked debuffs, you can gain that advantage. But yeah, as you can see, otherwise it's pretty standard. Run the cavalry largely up the front, get your heroes on there to start pinning things down, try to focus down their hero as much as you can. But yeah, we get the Reiksguard out on the flanks, and then apparently we sit and do nothing with them for a little bit here. It would be amazing if they were charging these Huntsmen down like this one on the side. Yeah, there we go. But so yeah, you can see you hit their front lines pretty hard. Boom, there's a Luminark snipe on Boris Todbringer. Man, that's devastating. That's kind of why you bring something like this, just for, like, because what else, if you don't have the ability to win a fight against somebody like Tyrion or Malekith or Luther Harkon, like, look at that snipe on this enemy steam tank, right? They're super useful for that. I don't know if the steam tanks are the missing piece that this composition had. Like I said, I think maybe just bringing something more like Outriders or even bringing more like cheaper cavalry and just being able to spread your lines out and hit them heavily. But you can see, as per usual, with this kind of aggressive playstyle coming from the Empire with the power of the units that they have, we're basically in an overwhelming victory, and we're going to win this fight even faster than the last cavalry fight that we did, with perhaps the exception of the steam tanks that are unbreakable. We're under 3 minutes in this fight is already done and decided. Yeah, so I feel like there's not too much to add to this one. Cavalry for the Empire, very strong. Adding on some of the high tier units, like the steam tanks for clumping, and having the like bringing something along for some kind of ranged capacity. Like I said, I think at this stage replacing the steam tanks with maybe something like Outriders would be good, or just bring a couple more Luminarks, because that's what you have these here for, right? These really are here for the high damage output and single target sniping. And yeah, clearly we lost that fight. So yeah, let's look at another composition. Alright, so the last army might surprise you, but we are going to bring a balanced army into the replays and see how this performs. One of the biggest advantages you have for something like this is that it's very cheap, right? If you remember from that last unit with the same kind of cost limit on here, we couldn't actually afford the previous army that I demoed, right? And you'd have to make some adjustments, or again, in campaign it's different, you know, you're not going to have like a hard limit on your income, but you can see compared to this army, we have a much lower cost, even though I expect that this will win again, right? And so this is something that can be useful. If you like this kind of playstyle, I want to show that it is still viable. You don't have to fully commit on the expensive units in the late game, and it's not even necessarily a good idea to do that, right? It's possible to have a blend of expensive units that are strong and have a good purpose, and then cheap, easily replaceable units that are used to protect and defend those more expensive units, right? So we've got a whole bunch of different things here, and I think even then there's room to mix and match, you know, having a couple of steam tanks in here to help hold the line, whether you replace the Huntsmen or Halberdiers, we could easily afford something like that, right? Maybe even throwing in some Reichsguard. Again, I don't like recommending something like that because artillery and cavalry kind of serve opposite purposes, and to try and be able to micromanage both successfully is going to be challenging. But you could put them in there if you want. They would serve a purpose, really. Like I said, you just don't have room to fit everything in, and the more you spread your focus, the less effective those things are. We'll see how it performs. I mean, I've tried to talk it up here, but I have in my notes that it's just really not that powerful. It appears to be diverse enough to handle different threats, but it's just not strong enough, and it's really only good for making cheaper armies, which you don't need to do by this point. So let's kind of jump in. I've offered some differing perspectives here. We'll jump in and see how it works. So just some notes on the formation here. I put these spearmen out front. Obviously the spearmen with shields are there to absorb any of like the missile unit damage. Huntsmen, don't forget that these have stock, so they're kind of hidden at the moment. And then we have the halberdiers here for the inevitable cavalry flank on our artillery. But since we have artillery, we can immediately start blasting down some of their units, and we start in range of them. So we don't have the same kind of issue that we did last time. We're also kind of hoping to sneak in. I mean, again, we've got, you know, we have the wizard. I brought a fire wizard with this composition because I think that's what it needs. A variety of offensive options with, you know, like 1 or 2 good buffs. And yeah, especially against an enemy with a bunch of infantry. You know, you can see we already had a ton of damage out there from the Hellstorm rocket batteries. We go and land a nice burning head there, and it's going to force a lot of them into offense. We even get a Hellstorm rocket battery to retreat from the amount of damage that we do to it. Should have 1 Luminark here, but I don't actually have it focusing on this Empire Captain, which I really should be, right? You bring this for the hero sniping. We do put a shot on their Bright Wizard regardless. And you can see, with the Hellblaster volley guns and the Huntsmen, we get enough damage out on this Empire Captain when he shows up to really stop him from doing anything useful. Again, now we've got the Demigryph Knights coming in, and we're not focus firing them too much with the Hellblaster. He's trying to take out Boris Todbringer. But with the hero and 2 Huntsmen getting nothing but free damage, I mean, the hero's holding the line. Spearmen are going to be able to get in there to pounce on them. But the Huntsman damage on those Demigryphs, I must have had a misclick. Oh no, they're trying to chase that unit down. Yeah, okay, definitely still a misclick. I'd like to say that didn't happen in the replay, but I expected that it most likely did. Just a classic little misclick, but they're still going to cycle charge, so we're going to have time to get out. And yeah, you can see their infantry's getting close, but you can also see this is kind of what I was talking about, right? The problem with this army is it's really not that powerful. We've gotten a lot of great damage out, but now their greatswords are starting to get to our front line, and we've seen what happens there. I don't know if the replay is broken or I just didn't turn off guard mode. I don't recommend running your spearmen out here like this. I don't really understand why that's happening. It could be a fault of the replay, or maybe I took them off guard mode and just forgot to replace it. Yeah, what these Huntsmen, this is not something I would do. I don't really, this replay is a little bit more broken than the rest. But you can see, right, so in terms of performance, we are kind of matching them for a reduced cost, right? We don't have to spend as much as them, and we can kind of have an army which has the ability to, like, we are winning this fight slowly but surely, but we're taking a lot of damage, and really you either want to bring like that cavalry, like infantry, offensive focused army and really just smash a field army like this to bits, or you want to bring a bunch of artillery so that you can just obliterate them. Like, for their greatswords to have reached our front line. That's not what we wanted to see, right? That's not what we saw with the actual artillery composition, and that artillery composition could easily be brought to a siege battle and win that as well. Now, you can see, like I said, we're still winning this. I think overall, you can say that we're going to win this. I don't really know. Some weird things happen in this replay that I can't necessarily explain properly. Yeah, why is Karl Franz out here with no health? There's definitely some misreads by the replay system here. Yeah, Death Embraces Your Lord. I can promise you that did not happen. But you can see, other than that, we've won this fight, and now it's just getting rid of the steam tanks that have the Unbreakable again. So there you have it. Proof that a balanced army can still work in this late game. You don't necessarily need to go all in on the expensive units. You don't have to pick a certain play style, but it should also show, right? This fight took twice as long, and I mean, I know I've talked about artillery fights maybe taking longer, but it just shows that this, like, the amount, let's go back here for a second. Like, look at the amount of damage that we took, right? We did beat them, and it had, like, a higher troop count, sure. And they had a higher value army, so that's still a win, right? But the amount of damage that we took, I mean, even with your maxed out heroes, this army's going to take 2 turns to recover. And this is the kind of situation where if we get attacked over the end turn, this army is not going to cut the cake anymore. Whereas with those other armies, we could probably take 2-3 fights in a row. So that's also something to keep in mind. In a one-on-one situation like this, we beat a superior army with a higher cost and better forces. But are you going to be able to, like, if this army gets wiped out on the following turn, like, then that's a net loss, right? Then you've lost value on the kind of army like this. So just something to keep in mind. So I think that does it for the kind of late game compositions that I wanted to show off. Like I said, I do think that in the late game, you can kind of get a little bit of create your own. If you bring like this kind of artillery, you can put whatever else you want to accompany it as the Empire, and you'll probably do fine. You want to make sure you can at least somewhat protect it with some anti-large options for their cavalry. You need enough of something to hold the front lines, and I don't know, sometimes it's fun to put some steam tanks in there to do that, but their cost is prohibitive. Being able to mix and match is definitely an option, like I said. And I don't think that there's any like real honorable mentions to bring out at tier 5 here. It's basically just like artillery spam or cavalry spam at this point, with supporting units, right? Making use of some of these top tier units like the Luminark, the Hellblaster, and the steam tank where you can find viability for it. But that should do it. I hope that these demonstrations have been effective and valuable for you. Somebody recommended that I do that because, you know, if I just talk about the units, it kind of seems like I'm reading off the unit card. I want to be able to show what some of these armies would look like in battle. I definitely left out a lot of potential combinations of units, right? Especially in terms of like the early game compositions. I feel like I spent so much time talking about those, and there's still so much more we could cover. But trying to give an idea of what's effective, right? What kinds of units you should focus on, the kind of like balance in terms of amounts of units that you should bring to the table, or the ratio of units that you should bring to the table in order to form effective armies, what kinds of strategies work especially well for the Empire, and what some of their best units are to focus on in the early game, the mid game, and the late game. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. I always really appreciate it. It helps the channel out. I really look forward to any comments, giving feedback on the video itself. If you agree or disagree with my compositions or choice of units, if you think that there's some especially important units that I left out, or you can come up with a better composition that you can use, or if you have your favorite Doom stack that you want to mention, please leave them in the comments. I'd love to see them. Discussion's always a good thing, and I'm always open to learning more about this game and improving my own abilities on it. And that should do it. I hope you have a great day. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.